one of the most interesting things to learn when you are reading the Christmas stories is that they weren't written in a vacuum. Most people are taught to read our Christmas stories, the Nativity in the Gospel, as if they're just standalone stories that just out of nowhere, the angels appear to the shepherds and said, "Behold, we have glad tidings, great news, joy." And actually, if you read it that way, it's an interesting enough story just as a standalone. But when you add the layer that these stories were not written in a vacuum, but that they have a context, that added layer is so fascinating because these stories were written in a time where there was already a gospel. We know from inscriptions of in Greek, the Greek language in the Roman world, that Caesar already had a gospel, an evangelion, an evangel, good news. And it was that he was going to bring order to the world and bring peace, and that was glad tidings, and he had a miraculous conception and birth. The gospel writers took these elements and they sort of hijacked them. It's almost like it's not quite a parody, but it's taking these elements that would have been familiar or well known and using them for their own purposes, adding a twist to them to say that this ruler that was coming, this king that was being born, that there was a miraculous conception and good news and angelic messengers. For some people, it's like disorienting when they learn that this is a context, a historical context, and they think, well, wait a minute. I didn't know that. And it completely like can undo some people. They just think, well, I wasn't told that and now I don't like this very much. But for me, it actually is like one of the most fascinating things to learn that these stories weren't written in a vacuum. They had a context. It would be like if you thought that the Beatles were the beginning of rock and roll and that no album like that had ever been put out, and you just listen to the album and you said, this is like the greatest thing, right? And that might be true. But then if you take a music appreciation class or a history of rock and roll and you listen to the albums that were out at that time, and it actually helps you to appreciate what the Beatles did, and it actually adds to their greatness. It helps you appreciate what they were doing and why it was so special. Or like if your mom or your grandmother had given you a quilt and you didn't know that like quilting was a thing and it had a context and it had a history, and you just thought that your mom or your grandma had come up with this idea and had made you this beautiful thing. Well, you could appreciate it, right, at some level for just what it is. But when you find out that there's this long history, this tradition of quilting, and then you see the gift that you've been given in the context of quilting and the long history of the art, then you start to appreciate your gift in a new way. And for me, that's what reading the Gospels, the Christmas stories, our nativity stories, in this context with the awareness of the historical background does for us. It opens up a new understanding. It adds an extra layer of appreciation for what the gospel writers are doing and why the story that they're telling us matters. And so for me, this is just a really valuable thing. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted to invite you to read The First Christmas with me this December, So I hope that you are enjoying it and that it is not bumming you out or confusing you or frustrating you to learn of the historical background and the context. I hope that it is adding an extra layer of meaning and understanding that's helping you to appreciate what's going on in the story. Let me know.